Thank you, Vincent, for that introduction. I've been coming to McGill since the early 1980s, so thanks to Joe Mulholland, and I've seen this school grow. Having missed a few years, I come back and see that it's virtually a university now in Glenties for a few weeks in July, August. Last night, listening to the Taoiseach, I was very energised by his vision for Ireland in the 21st century. His emphasis on youth and that he hopes his government will, in a sense, leave a legacy in that particular area, also in the area for people of the older generation. Again, sort of showing that his emphasis is very humanistic and very laudatory. I want to make a few preliminary remarks before dealing with the historical dimension of my topic. But in the context of where we stand today, I think that we face in this country a major democratic crisis. And I think there is a danger that the economic solution of austerity being adopted to deal with the crisis is changing the relationship between the citizen and the state. And will the crisis place a far greater concentration of power in the hands of a state that has already one of the most centralised systems of government among the older member states of Europe? This new technocratic form of governance being imposed on Ireland and many struggling members of the EU may deflect the EU from its original objective to build an integrated, united Europe based on the humanistic, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, anti-authoritarian philosophies of the Second World War resistance movements. Where has that social idealism of the 1950s gone to found a united Europe based on progressive social democratic and Christian social ideals? What is likely to emerge from this period of crisis is unclear. I think the worst possible outcome for Ireland, and it's not improbable, will be the evolution of a two-speed Europe with a core and a periphery, destroying the very philosophical foundations on which the European project was originally based. I think the European Union seeks to guide its way out of crisis. As it does this, the oxygen of hope may be drained from Ireland and other countries, Greece, Spain and Portugal, which have closed the door to employment for many young people due to recruitment embargoes in the state sector, a sector which is seriously in need of new thinking and new ideas, the kind of thinking which might be supplied by new generations of recruits who are currently locked out of the system. And I speak in relation to many of my graduates, postgraduates, postdocs, etc., who are confronted by these closed doors in Irish society today. So how stands the Republic? Well, casting an eye back to the revolutionary period between 1916 and 1921, the mood today is very much more sombre than in those heady years immediately after the 1916 Rising, when hope of independence moved closer to being a reality. The words of the proclamation appeared to be about to be turned into political reality in 1921. And the words are worth repeating because they, in today's political parlance, sound very pietistic, but they're worth pondering. We declare, according to the proclamation of 1916, the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. The Republic, according to the proclamation, guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens, cherishing all the children of the nation equally. The democratic programme adopted by Dáil Éireann in January 1919 affirmed the duty of every man and woman to give allegiance and service to the Commonwealth, and in return, we, in the name of the Republic, declare the right of every citizen to an adequate share of the produce of the nation's labour. Both founding documents of the Irish state established a binding contract between citizen and the Republic, protecting the rights and the well-being of each citizen. However, the Irish state, founded in 1922, with its high hopes and high expectations of bringing into being a new social order, fell very far short of the mark. The national unity which drove the struggle for independence fragmented with the signing of the treaty, and by the summer of 1922, Irishmen and Irish women were engaged in a destructive civil war with long-reaching consequences for the nature of Irish democracy. Allegiance to the Irish state became a contested allegiance. The state was not coterminous with the nation. That contested nature of the new state initially resulted in De Valera and his followers placing a greater loyalty on party rather than to the state. That sens de l'État, spoken of so eloquently during World War II by General de Gaulle, did not bind the parties in the 1920s, as had been the case when Sinn Féin was a united movement before the signing of the treaty. Fianna Fáil refashioned the state through the De Valera constitutional revolution in the 1930s, culminating in the adoption of a new constitution in 1937. And here I might just mention, in relation to the discussion last night, that the new state, for all its shortcomings, that is the Cumann Gael state, or at least government in the 1920s, did do many things in very difficult and adverse circumstances that helped shape the kind of country that De Valera inherited in 1932. And in relation to civil service, the setting up of the Civil Service Commission, the creation of a civil service that was not political, that was professional, was one of the great legacies of the Cumann Gael government of 1922. An unarmed police force, a professional army, very many things that from the 1920s in very difficult and very problematical circumstances were, in a sense, created by people who had a vision and had an image of what needed to be done and where the foundations should be laid and dug deep in Irish society. But of course, the wider aspirations spoken about by Elaine in relation to education, etc., fell very short of the mark. The Irish Civil War created the two-tier party system, or a two-and-a-half-party system. That is the phrase of Brian Farrell. The Civil War left the state in a very weak financial situation. And while that meant that the state had to abandon the ambitious social thinking of pre-treaty days, it also made the Irish Free State very heavily dependent upon large institutions like the Catholic Church and many powerful interest groups in that society. Now, I don't have time to speak about other interests, but I'll focus on the Church that I've done a considerable amount of work on. But there are many vested interests in Irish society that had a strong relationship with the Irish state and whose history has yet to be written. And the banking sort of links with banking in Ireland from the 1920s onwards is a subject that is very worthy of closer attention. But the Catholic hierarchy in the aftermath of the treaty gave political support to the government in the 1920s and transferred that support to Fianna Fáil from the 1930s. Clashes between church and state were uncommon, with the exception of the mother and child crisis in 1951. And until the 1970s, or indeed one might argue until 1983, the ground was not really that contested between church and state in Ireland. The intimate relationship between church and state had serious consequences for the working of the state, as successive governments continued the British system of franchising out, for example, institutional childcare to the respective churches and religious communities. Although the state had statutory responsibility for the financing and oversight of, for example, industrial schools, orphanages and Magdalen laundries, we now know that a weak Irish state, failed to exercise the mandate to cherish all the children of the nation equally. The state had statutory responsibility which it failed to discharge and must accept today the financial implications of that sustained failure. The Catholic Church under the prescriptions of the gospel fell very far short of the ethical standards which it had been entrusted to fulfill as far back as the 1870s, when industrial schools, for example, came into being. The Catholic Church today, too, must face the consequences of that lamentable failure. There were a number of factors which, in my view, helped preserve between the political parties as governments changed this sens de l'État during the early decades of the state. First of all, there was a shared historical experience coming out of the struggle for independence and a commitment to a nationalist ideology, which all the major parties supported. Therefore, Irish leaders from William T. Cosgrave to Jack Lynch and Liam Cosgrave and Garret Fitzgerald had a strong sense of purpose. They were trying to build an Irish state. And in turn, successive governments developed a strong semi-state sector. And I think the civil and public service from the foundation of the state sought to impose high standards of governance and probity. And I think that is a point worth pondering when we deal with the reform of the civil service. But other factors worked to give the Irish state a very conservative character. That is, the Irish state operated through the decades under a virtual permanent state of emergency since the Civil War. The state confronted recruiting by the IRA and recurring threats of subversion from that organisation. The state faced threats of invasion during the Second World War and confronted the threat and the insecurity of communism during the Cold War. And of course, just to go back and re-emphasise the recurring revolutionary activities of the IRA from the 50s to the 90s, which the opportunity cost of managing that particular crisis by the Irish state has yet to be calibrated. There was no wish by any party in power until as late as the 1980s to challenge the practice of this system of closed government in any systematic way. I think membership of the European Economic Community in 1973 offered a great opportunity to reform and to modernise government structures and decision-making processes. Unfortunately, membership of the EEC reinforced the centralised nature of Irish government decision-making, and local government had little opportunity to benefit from the disbursement of funds from Brussels. The abolition of rates on domestic dwellings in 1977 left local authorities in Ireland in a poverty-stricken state. And why, at that point, did Ireland, that is in the 70s, not introduce the taxes like property tax, water charges, and even a wealth tax? There was an effort to do that, an effort that failed, one might say, almost heroically. Some of those essential reforms in the Irish system were only delivered under the directives of the Troika. And if the Troika and the the diktats have served any purpose, they have jolted this state into having to accept that there are bases for taxation which cannot be avoided. What went wrong then in Ireland, and why did it go wrong? How did this country drift towards a period of complete laissez-aller in the 1990s and early part of the 21st century? Well, of course, we could speak about the northern situation since the 1960s, presenting the Irish government with a permanent challenge which drained its resources. One could argue that the political will to reform the ageing Irish government system was weak and ineffectual. One could say that there were countervailing forces at work in the 1980s, which probably for the first time in the history of the state revealed that there was corruption in Irish society at the very top level. The political career of Charles Haughey as Taoiseach has been well documented by tribunals. But this was really part of a system which has yet to be properly evaluated. The temptations were great and the rewards were lucrative for politicians in a position to influence planning decisions and weak enough to accept a bribe. The nationwide scale of that problem, again, is something which is understudied. In effect, what I'm saying is there was a system that the failure to develop systems, the failure to develop strong local government, the failure to develop strong central government, gave rise to these practices, which would otherwise have been curtailed and contained in other circumstances. The credit for scrutinising the workings of the Irish state must go, and here there's a sort of almost a counter-cultural side to sort of Irish life which has to be recognised. Firstly, to the setting up, and this relatively late in the history of the state, the setting up of the Office of Ombudsman, which first was occupied by Michael Mills in 1984, and that office has done a great deal to make the workings of the Irish state more transparent, and full credit must reside with Mills and his two successors, the late Kevin Murphy and the current incumbent Emily O'Reilly. Secondly, the Freedom of Information Act 1997 was of inestimable value in providing citizens with access to information held by public bodies and government departments. And in an act of civil vandalism, I don't intend to sort of modify that comment, the Fianna Fáil PD government in the early part of the 21st century amended and constricted that act, a serious reversal for those in favour of moving Ireland towards more open government. Happily, however, that new legislation in autumn 2013 will restore and extend the working of that act. And I think another act that was important in terms of opening up Irish society, and particularly for historians and academics, that is the National Archives Act of 1986, opened up the files of government archives under a 30-year rule. And finally, the use of tribunals and inquiries have helped shed light on hidden areas of public life and state institutions, as have also the expanded workings of Oireachtas committees. But I think these measures came too late to prevent many of the terrible problems that this state confronted in the latter part of the 20th century. And I'm sort of forced to conclude that one of the reasons why the Irish state failed to measure up to its responsibilities was largely due to the development of a model which moved away from that neo-corporate idea of state engagement and state involvement and big government, if you like, in the sort of earlier part of the history of this state, moving it more towards the idea of neoliberalism and allowing the sort of free market full reign. And the free market certainly had free and full reign in this country in the latter part of the 20th century. I don't know how and why the checks and balances in Irish political systems failed to curtail the worst excesses of the Celtic Tiger. I don't know why the traditional Irish banks, as conservative as one might find anywhere, allowed their fundamental philosophy to change and thus expose Irish taxpayers to catastrophic losses. Why was that disastrous change in philosophy not preempted at an early stage before the damage was done? Why was regulation of the banking sector so ineffectual during those critical years? Why did an Irish government sign away billions in 2008 that will result in a form of intergenerational debt peonage for decades to come? The answer to these questions, I think, is partially provided by the way in which certain political philosophies sought to dismantle the state and its effectiveness in dealing with these particular areas. A dismantling of the sort of apparatus of the state, the better to enable free enterprise, full reign. And in the delirium of the world of the Celtic Tiger, and I always regard that as a vulgarism besides being some kind of oxymoron, values were certainly different from those that helped create, that were very different from what we sort of experienced in this society before. We've read and heard about the Anglo tapes in all their crassness and crudity. Where was their séance d'état when you think of these people sitting in their offices talking about the future of the Irish state? What allegiance did they have to that particular state? It didn't exist. I found the following example, which illustrates the point that I want to emphasize about a culture that had become so mercenary that it did not care about people or indeed the welfare of the country. In the book by the Fitzpatrick tapes, the authors, Tom Lyons and Brian Carey, describing Mr. Fitzpatrick speaking about a meeting in London to consider taking over a number of hotels, including, I think, Claridge's. The consortium of developers was very enthusiastic about what they could do to modernise the hotels system. Mr. Fitzpatrick paraphrased a member of the group, bubbling over with enthusiasm for change. And this member of the group consortium wanted to convert a hotel car park into a gym or a bar, and he continued, member of the consortium. And then, why we have Joe Bloggs in there cutting hair. F him out and we get in Fabiola. There is a jeweller down there called John Doe. F him out and we will get in Cartier. And then back to Fitzpatrick. The guys were bang, bang, bang. So in the bang, bang, bang culture of the Celtic Tiger, citizens obviously sort of came second best to the vested interests and to the sort of way in which these crusading and buccaneering entrepreneurs developed their portfolios and left this country in a state of debt peonage. While the Celtic Tiger may have long gone, that crudity, as expressed, for example, in what I've quoted above, and in the recent publication of the Anglo tapes, is still with us. And that same mercenary attitude to ordinary citizens survives in certain quarters in Ireland today. So just because the Celtic Tiger has departed, it doesn't mean that the sort of the values that brought the Celtic Tiger into existence have been defeated and curtailed. I think in the efforts to get out of the enveloping economic crisis, many of the same values that created the delirium of the Celtic Tiger are still here, now pressing for the selling off of state assets and the stripping back of the state sector, as if the sale of our telephone network was not a warning enough. Will we soon face the privatisation, and this is something where I've worked for 30 years, of third-level education in this country, and the creation of elitist universities, recruiting only the 600 points people, recruiting only those who equate points with intelligence or with ability. One spent 30 years in university life trying to sort of develop people in terms of their own ability and their own potential. And this idea that you can recruit people into a university and into universities at 600 points and expect the society to benefit and to have the best people in society educated in that way is an idolatry. So how stands the Republic in 2013? There is, in my view, a crisis of the Irish state, and it is all the more profound because there is no mobilization of civic society to confront the crisis. There is no sense of outrage. And I think the idea of allowing politicians to solve the problem, as if we, the citizens, are sitting back and allowing sort of this to happen in a passive way, is probably problematical. I go back again to why embargo jobs in the public sector in this radical way. I know there's been some relaxation in recent times, but why deny young people the chance of a career and a livelihood in this country? Why has government not mobilised third-level education institutions in this country to develop a national strategy to get qualified people on the dole, to develop new skills, or simply, and this is a revolutionary idea in terms of the pragmatic philosophies that dominate education today. That is, why don't we get sort of people to develop new skills or, in a sense, go to universities, third-level colleges, simply to become better educated? The alternative is to lose a few generations to emigration of those who do not wish to go. Why, at this critical juncture, tinker around with bicameral system of Parliament, which was one of the jewels in the crown of W.T. Cosgrave in the 1920s? Will this not make young people even more cynical about politics? In conclusion, I will draw your attention, having made reference to the revolutionary generation that helped defeat Nazism and fascism, the resistance movement. But a few years ago, a resistance veteran and concentration camp survivor, Stephen Hessel, wrote a best-selling pamphlet in France, and he directed his final words in the pamphlet towards young people of France, and his pamphlet was entitled Time for Outrage. And his concluding words were, "To you who will create the 21st century, we say with affection, to create is to resist is to create." So can one think of better advice to give a young Irish people who will have the responsibility for creating a new Ireland in the 21st century? We need to realise that now is a time for outrage and measured action. Thank you.